How does composition and blocking communicate to the audience and reflect the character's mental state? The word blocking, or staging, refers to the placement and movement of the characters and camera in a scene, whereas the composition of a shot is the arrangement of the subjects in the frame. So before planning a scene, there are a number of considerations to take into account, like what is the character's emotional state, what is the intention of the scene, what is the character's relationship. Katz explains in Film Directing Cinematic Motion that when composing a scene, the director has to take into account narrative, dramatic, and pictorial considerations. By this he means, as well as making the scenes entertaining, the blocking and cinematography can advance the narrative and can be a way of providing the audience with subconscious information. Light Film School calls blocking the language of film, as it can hold subtext, meaning even when the audience don't realise they have been impacted by a scene, they will have an emotional takeaway. The protagonist in my upcoming short film grieves for her daughter, and because of this suffers from hallucinations, an unstable state of mind, and her mental health hugely impacted. In this video, we're going to be looking deeper into these elements in which you create subtext in order to reflect the character's mental state. My research indicates that the mind goes through a process of grieving, meaning one's mood can shift, bringing me to the conclusion that my blocking and composition would also have to change as my character's mindset does. Mental Health America goes through this process and how it affects someone physically, emotionally, and psychologically. But how do we bring these emotions into cinema? BBC Culture writes that creative drama is drawn to the complexity and fragility of the mind. Therefore, many directors replicate grief and mental illness on screen. Characters who suffer from grief in films like Shutter Island and my own film eventually fall victim to insanity. I want the blocking and composition in my film to resemble insanity, a mental illness of such a severe nature that a person cannot distinguish reality from fantasy, and to symbolise my character's fragile and erratic state of mind. So, here are some of the ways in which this can be done. Whether it be character or camera movement, movement can do so much psychologically in a scene, so much so that changes in movement can reflect changes in the story. Movement is powered by emotion, therefore emotion can change movement, and movement can change the emotion. Movements have psychological connotations. For example, if you change the space between the characters, you indicate a change in their relationship. Characters walking towards or away from one another could indicate fear or anger. Newton's first law of motion states, every object in a state of uniform motion tends to remain in that state of motion unless an external force is applied to it. This means, like objects, characters must be motivated before they make an action. Even though we don't realise ourselves that we have these motivations when having a conversation, we make these movements depending on our emotion. As well as character movement, camera movement can also be driven by emotion and can tell us the character's current mental state. For example, shaky camera movements can create chaos and show instability, whereas stable, smooth camera movements can give the sense of control, sometimes a foreboding feel. David Fincher rarely uses handheld, but when he does, he chooses wisely. In Seven, he only uses handheld on the detectives, so it's shaky as their mental state is discomposed, desperately and frantically trying to stop the killer, whereas John Doe's camera movements are always stable, not only to give him power but because he is calm. Fincher explains that he prefers to use controlled, smooth camera movements as it doesn't have any personality to it. It's very much like what's happening is what's doomed to happen. Therefore, he doesn't like bringing any attention to the fact that there's someone behind the camera. A film in which the character's mental state is similar to my own film is Black Swan. When we see Nina, the camera is shaky. In fact, this handheld shakiness is constant to keep the audience on edge, like the character is, as we experience her mind's deterioration through camera movement, as she begins to hallucinate. Hitchcock's famous line, "If it's a good movie, the sound could go off and the audience would still have a perfectly clear idea of what's going on," links to all of these elements, as even when watching a film without sound, the movements can give you a sense of the emotion in the scene. Another way of impacting the audience is with the 3 S's: size, shape, space. When these 3 elements are added into the blocking and framing and have an applied subtext, they can tell us a lot about a scene. Firstly, size. The size of something within the frame is a good indicator of its importance, whether it be a character or an object. Like Hitchcock says, the size of an object in the frame should equal its importance in the story at that moment. Furthermore, size can also reflect how the character is feeling. In the King's Speech, King Edward is nervous to speak in front of thousands of people, and this shot highlights this with the size of the microphone. It intimidates and overwhelms, and the audience can feel this. Next, shapes. Shapes not only mirror the character's mentality, but have an impact on the audience, as we have a shared understanding that circles can feel inclusive, being used to either create a safe environment or to create an intimidating one. Squares can be used to box someone in, feeling trapped, and triangles are sharp, acting as a great way of directing the viewer's eye. Lines are also a way of directing the eye, whether they're physical lines pointing in a particular direction, or whether they're a character, as they are also a line. You have horizontal, and you have vertical. These lines can then provide us with the character's mindset and the power dynamic. The character standing could be the more confident, holding all the knowledge, and the character horizontally is more inferior in the situation. Finally, space. As previously mentioned, changing the space between characters can be metaphorical, and moving characters away from one another creates emotional distance. Through composition, every shot can tell a story on its own. It can also symbolise the character's emotion, like fragility. In composition and storytelling, it's pointed out that deciding the placements of subjects through the viewfinder of a camera isn't merely a technical decision, it's an expressive one. Therefore, it's not just where we place our subjects, but why. For example, the use of negative space creates emptiness, which emphasises either how lonely and hopeless the character is, or in horror can unnerve the audience, as characters can appear vulnerable. Angles also have a big impact on how the audience views the characters. Eye-level framing is important, as it positions us at the same level as the character, making us equals. Consequently, the audience being able to relate more to them. This means that this angle helps your audience stay connected to a flawed or mentally unstable character. A close-up angle is also powerful when used sparingly, as close-ups can be intimate and revealing of the character's stability and their inner feelings. David Fincher stating,
"Every time you go to a close-up, the audience knows subconsciously that you've made an editorial decision, that you said, look at this is important."
Therefore, a close-up signals something of importance and can provide the audience with a piece of information significant in the narrative. Close-ups can also be used to show the audience the character's eyes, as eyes can tell a whole story. There's psychological evidence that eye contact is highly compelling. We're more attuned to faces whose eyes are trained on us. Additionally, we like people more when these others appear to engage us through eye contact, provided the eye contact is offered in a non-threatening situation. This means when a character looks into the camera lens, the audience look deep into their eyes and decide whether to trust them, and if they feel empathy towards them, then they identify with them. Sometimes directors even hide a character's eyes to hide their humanity, making the audience unsure whether they trust them. I will take my research and use the elements I've found to highlight that my character is alone, through, for example, empty space, and use shapes and leading lines to direct the viewer's eye to the daughter's bedroom door as she hallucinates it beckoning her in. But the one question is, how do I show my character's journey in the film as her mentality deteriorates? Shutter Island does this. At the beginning of the film, Teddy controls the blocking and camera movement. This is because he is confident and believes he is of a sound mind at the start of the film. Teddy is also almost always at the centre of the frame with 2 people either side of him, so that the composition is balanced. One way Scorsese invites us to identify with Teddy in the first half of the film is by using eye-level framing. But in the second half of the film, as the mystery is unravelled and Teddy becomes more delusional, Scorsese starts to use high-angle shots, looking down on Teddy, making him smaller, more vulnerable. Then in the final scene, when the plot twist is revealed and Teddy is told he is not a marshal but a mental patient, meaning he becomes agitated and emotional, the blocking and composition shifts to match his new mental state. We see him from 20 different angles, quick shots of Teddy's tremors to show his instability. He is also now off-centre, indicating to the audience his loss of control. This contrasts with Dr. Corley's smooth, controlled camera movements, in which he is balanced within the frame and only is given 3 or 4 angles. But when proof is handed to Teddy and he begins to comprehend the information, the audience are also encouraged to comprehend and piece things together through the use of the slow, rotating camera movement to signify the cogs in his head turning, the audience subconsciously making these connections. But when he chooses not to believe what the doctor is saying, the smooth shot is suddenly broken by a different angle with his outburst of aggression. The audience understand this change in mood as denial. Teddy's shots are also choppy, sometimes with no continuity to them, all to give a sense of his unbalanced mind. Therefore, the visual elements in Shutter Island change all for the audience's benefit to show them Teddy's mind unravelling. So, storytelling can be done through framing, movement, space, shapes and lines. Even the way you walk can tell a story. And by making the film visual, we can understand it on a deeper subconscious level. Therefore, blocking can in fact be more revealing than the dialogue. These cinematic choices, evident in works like Fincher, Scorsese and Aronofsky, can reflect the character's mental states and have been a huge influence in how I want to invoke an emotional impact on my audience. Nevertheless, films are still open to perspective, meaning directors are unrestricted in what they can do through composition and blocking.
The audience knows you can do anything, so the question is, what don't you do?
Therefore, staging is at the centre of the director's craft.